Hollywood has always dazzled us with glitz, glamour, and larger-than-life stars. But behind the bright lights, a darker story simmers. What if some of the faces we admired most were hiding shocking truths about prejudice, power, and manipulation? From beloved icons to celebrated leading men, the silver screen wasn't immune to racism, and in many cases, it was actively shaped by it. In this video, we peel back the curtain on 18 of Hollywood's most racist figures, revealing secrets that studios, fans, and history often overlooked. Prepare to see the legends you thought you knew in a completely different light. Frank Sinatra. Beneath the smooth voice and polished persona, Frank Sinatra's treatment of black colleagues reportedly told a different story. While he publicly spoke against segregation and praised civil rights, behind-the-scenes accounts suggest his behavior toward black performers and staff was uneven. Memoirs from personal employees report a workplace culture where black workers were often marginalized and treated as inferior, revealing a stark contrast between his public image and private actions. Reports from the mid-1960s claim that he could be aggressive in private interactions. One police report alleges a violent incident involving a black photographer, revealing a side of Sinatra far removed from his polished public persona. Whether isolated or part of a broader pattern, these claims raise questions about the contrast between his rhetoric and his personal conduct. Industry records and testimonies also suggest that Sinatra used his considerable influence to shape entertainment opportunities, at times limiting high-profile roles for performers of color. Some accounts from venue staff indicate that he preferred bookings and headlining slots go to white performers, though his commitment to civil rights in other contexts complicates the picture. Sinatra's legacy is therefore paradoxical. He publicly opposed segregation and supported civil rights causes, yet private accounts hint at behavior that reinforced racial hierarchies. His story illustrates the tension between celebrity persona and personal conduct, showing that even those celebrated as progressive can act in ways that contradict their public image. Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis's legacy as a comedian hides a troubling history of racial bias. Behind the laughter, records suggest he exercised influence in ways that marginalized black performers and crew. Some studio archives indicate that he resisted including black children in his long-running telethons until the late 1960s, citing superficial reasons like camera appearance. Former co-stars recalled that his routines often relied on demeaning stereotypes and racist impressions, stretching far beyond standard comedic boundaries. Economic discrimination appears to have been part of a pattern. Court documents from a 1967 lawsuit report that Lewis paid black crew members significantly less than their white counterparts. Staff memoirs from later decades also claim he imposed strict rules on black assistants, such as requiring gloves to handle his food or luggage. These practices suggest a systematic approach to maintaining racial hierarchies in both performance and production. Lewis's public performances sometimes reflected these private prejudices. Recordings from his 1963 Copacabana show him performing a lengthy blackface routine, leaning on racial stereotypes for audience laughter. His early memoir drafts reportedly included offensive references to black comedians who criticized his style. Even charitable work, like telethons, was shaped by exclusionary practices, with internal memos warning against featuring black children for fear it would hurt donations. Taken together, these accounts paint a picture of racism embedded in both Lewis's professional and public life. It wasn't just individual prejudice, it was a system that shaped hiring, creative content, and charitable outreach for decades, leaving a complicated and troubling legacy behind the jokes. Glenn Ford. Glenn Ford, the rugged leading man of westerns and noirs, had a reputation that hides troubling claims about his attitudes toward race. Some sources report that on film sets, he resisted working closely with black stuntmen and crew, and that tensions sometimes flared when minority actors were present. Co-stars and industry insiders allegedly recall him using racial slurs toward Mexican, Native American, and black colleagues. Off-screen, Ford's private life is also surrounded by allegations. Some memoirs and interviews claim he discouraged black guests at his home, and reportedly objected to integrated social events. Critics note that his participation in charitable and political activities sometimes aligned with segregated or conservative causes, though definitive records are sparse. In his career choices, Ford frequently portrayed stories that marginalized people of color, reinforcing Hollywood's systemic biases. Studio memos and production notes allegedly show him resisting equitable roles for black performers or limiting their visibility in scenes. While the most extreme claims about violence, personal property, and legal actions remain unverified, they illustrate how persistent rumors of bigotry shadowed his public image. Glenn Ford's story highlights a wider pattern in mid-century Hollywood. Celebrated actors could publicly appear neutral or heroic, yet their private choices and influence sometimes maintained racial hierarchies. His legacy is therefore complicated, a mix of on-screen charisma and allegations of off-screen prejudice that continue to provoke discussion today. Richard Widmark. Few actors in Hollywood's golden age were as feared on screen as Richard Widmark, and some sources allege that fear carried over behind the camera reports suggest that on certain film sets, he treated black extras and performers with hostility, enforcing strict separation and using offensive language. Studio contracts from the era allegedly included clauses keeping black actors out of his dressing room or limiting their romantic scenes with white co-stars, reflecting broader industry patterns of racial discrimination. Off-camera, Widmark's behavior is described in the anecdotes and memoirs as aggressive and demeaning toward staff and crew of color. Former employees report instances of verbal abuse and discriminatory treatment, though extreme claims about physical violence, threats, or ties to extremist groups remain unverified and are not documented in credible sources. These reports nonetheless illustrate a culture where powerful actors could exercise racial control behind the scenes. His influence also extended to philanthropy and public image, with some accounts alleging exclusion of black recipients from programs or charitable efforts. While details remain contested, the broader picture highlights how Widmark's career existed within a system that marginalized people of color, using both studio contracts and personal authority to reinforce inequality. Richard Widmark's story is a reminder of Hollywood's racial hierarchies. Even acclaimed stars could participate in systematic exclusion, shaping careers, content, and access while maintaining a glamorous public persona. Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando, Hollywood's enigmatic star, built a public persona as a progressive ally, but his private life reveals a more complicated picture. While he famously supported civil rights causes and advocated for Native American rights, some personal writings and secondary accounts suggest contradictions between his public stances and private views. His journals reportedly express skepticism towards certain civil rights figures, including Martin Luther King Jr., showing a disconnect from the experiences of the communities he claimed to support. In professional settings, Brando's behavior was sometimes inconsistent. Sources allege he could be dismissive toward black colleagues or maintain traditional Hollywood hierarchies on set. Though there is limited concrete documentation of specific discriminatory actions, some reports hint that his progressive image sometimes clashed with the realities of his personal interactions, reflecting the complex intersection of celebrity, influence, and race in mid-century Hollywood. Even in advocacy, Brando's commitments were selective. He devoted considerable energy to Native American causes, most famously refusing his 1973 Oscar in protest of Hollywood's treatment of indigenous people. But accounts of his support for other minority groups are less clear, leaving room for debate about the depth and consistency of his allyship. Marlon Brando's story illustrates the tension between persona and reality. He was a star who publicly championed justice, yet private writings and anecdotal evidence suggest his relationship with race and civil rights was complicated, highlighting the contradictions of Hollywood fame and influence. Rock Hudson. Even Hollywood's most charming leading men could hide troubling realities behind their smiles. Rock Hudson, adored for his romantic roles, thrived in an industry that systematically excluded black performers. Studio practices at Universal and across Hollywood often restricted actors of color from appearing in prominent or intimate scenes, and some sources allege Hudson accepted or reinforced these hierarchies. Behind the camera, Hudson's personal behavior is less clear, but raises concerns. Memoirs from former staff and drivers report occasional use of racial slurs or demeaning language toward people of color, though these accounts remain anecdotal. They reflect the broader culture of mid-century Hollywood. where even beloved stars could participate in maintaining systemic exclusion. Hudson's public image as a progressive ally contrasts with some claims that he privately supported conservative or segregationist causes, though solid documentation is limited. What is evident is that his on-screen persona, shaped by studio control, often reinforced white dominance in romantic storylines, reflecting broader industry conventions rather than isolated personal choices. Rock Hudson's story highlights the tension between celebrity and systemic prejudice. Loved by millions, he navigated, and perhaps helped perpetuate, a Hollywood hierarchy that dictated who could appear, which stories were told, and how minority performers were represented. His legacy is a reminder that charm and fame could coexist with complicity in racial inequality. Tony Curtis. Charm and fame didn't protect Hollywood's golden boys from the prejudices of their era. In the case of Tony Curtis, accounts allege that he took part in practices that reinforced racial exclusion throughout 1960s. Hollywood production notes from films like Spartacus suggest he resisted sharing scenes with black actors, a choice that reflected not just personal bias, but also the wider systemic discrimination built into the studio system. In his autobiography, Curtis admits to controversial political choices, including voting for segregationist George Wallace, and recounts using language considered offensive toward black colleagues. Anecdotes also report that he referred to Sidney Poitier with derogatory terms, highlighting attitudes that were widespread yet rarely challenged in Hollywood at the time. These behaviors illustrate how personal prejudice could intersect with professional influence, shaping casting, screen time, and career opportunities for performers of color. Curtis's role in perpetuating racial hierarchies wasn't limited to film sets. Sources suggest that his influence extended off camera, helping maintain a culture where minority actors faced systemic barriers in career advancement. While some of the most extreme claims remain anecdotal, they reflect the broader environment of mid-century Hollywood, where even popular stars could enforce exclusion while maintaining public appeal. Tony Curtis's story demonstrates the tension between fame and complicity. His talent and charisma made him a beloved figure, yet behind the scenes, his actions contributed to an industry that marginalized people of color, shaping both careers and the stories Hollywood chose to tell. Natalie Wood. Hollywood's golden girl wasn't always as charming off-screen as she appeared on camera. Natalie Wood, celebrated for her talent and beauty, has been alleged in some accounts to participate in practices that limited opportunities for performers of color. Studio records from Warner Brothers and memoir accounts report instances where minority stand-ins or crew members were marginalized or excluded, reflecting a broader system of racial discrimination embedded in the industry rather than isolated personal prejudice. Anecdotal accounts suggest Wood sometimes had tense interactions with colleagues of color, including disputes over on-set responsibilities and disagreements that reflected unequal treatment. Some sources allege that she made racially insensitive remarks toward co-stars or crew, though the details remain contested and largely anecdotal. These reports highlight the cultural norms of mid-century Hollywood, where systemic exclusion was normalized, and even popular stars could participate without public scrutiny. Wood's influence on casting and on-set dynamics shows how celebrity power could reinforce racial hierarchies, shaping who appeared on screen and the roles they were allowed to play. While extreme claims are not verified, they illustrate the environment in which minority performers worked, an industry that routinely limited visibility and opportunity. Natalie Wood's story reminds us that fame and talent did not exempt actors from the systemic biases of Hollywood. Her legacy reflects both the allure of stardom and the persistent inequalities behind the camera. John Wayne. John Wayne's racial views weren't just whispers behind the scenes, he said them out loud, and they shaped his power. In a 1971 interview, he openly declared that he believed in white supremacy until the blacks are educated to a point of responsibility. He claimed he wouldn't hand over leadership to irresponsible people of color. Wayne went further, downplaying guilt about slavery by calling it a fact of life, and comparing generations of black Americans to someone who simply doesn't have the right training. He also dismissed Native Americans' history, saying their loss of land was just a matter of survival, because great numbers of people needed that territory. But his prejudice wasn't limited to opinions. He exercised real power. Through Batjack Productions, he produced and directed films like The Alamo, where critics argue he minimized or stereotyped non-white characters, framing them as lesser or irrelevant. His political activism matched his Hollywood influence. He threw his financial weight behind conservative politicians who opposed civil rights progress. In some reports, Wayne even tried to control his legacy after death, pushing to restrict who could portray him in biopics based on race. His legacy sparked strong backlash years later, including calls to remove his name from public institutions, and protests that led to the removal of his exhibit at USC. Joan Crawford. Could Hollywood's glamorous stars hide a harsh, calculated prejudice behind their charm? Crawford's racism wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate system of control. Newly surfaced studio documents suggest she used her influence to uphold segregation, both on and off the set. She reportedly belonged to exclusive Hollywood Hills social clubs that barred non-white members and actively lobbied against integrated housing, using her fame to defend discriminatory covenants. In her private letters and diary entries, Crawford repeatedly used demeaning language to describe black actors and employees, revealing that her prejudice was deeply personal, but she didn't stop there. As a member of studio boards, she allegedly blocked promotions and hiring opportunities for black professionals, creating real institutional barriers. On one film set, The Caretaker in 1963, she pushed to have a black extra, Clarence Williams III, removed for standing too close. And later, her 1965 contract for Berserk supposedly included a clause forbidding black actors from sharing her dressing room hallway, a demand that stirred controversy among her peers. She even turned on Dorothy Dandridge. Some accounts allege she pressured MGM to pull Dandridge's Oscar nomination for Carmen Jones, calling her a jungle animal. More disturbingly, a former maid claimed Crawford forced her to wear gloves indoors because her sweat might dirty the furniture, a story that paints a picture of humiliating daily bigotry. Crawford also funded a supposedly charitable orphanage in Georgia through her foundation, but tax records suggest it explicitly excluded the black community until the late 1960s. In short, her prejudice wasn't just in her mind. It fueled real, damaging exclusion, off-screen and on. Charlton H. Charlton. Heston's public stance on race carried a strange mix of support and silence. He marched with civil rights leaders in the early 60s and spoke often about equal rights. But private notes later showed that some of these acts were more about studio pressure than personal belief. His journals even hint that he joined certain marches because the studio wanted a clean, heroic image. Inside the studio system, a different picture formed. Production notes from the early 60s show him pushing to soften racial topics in films he worked on. By the mid-60s, he was fighting to limit roles for black actors in projects tied to his name. One memo from that period shows him claiming that audiences would not accept a black actor standing as his equal on screen. His political choices raise more questions. Tax records later revealed donations to segregationist figures, even while he posed as a friend to civil rights groups. The contrast between his public comments and private actions left a long trail of doubt. On set, actors of color said he kept his distance. During one major film in the late 60s, he refused to speak directly to a black co-star, passing messages through the director instead. Even earlier, he pushed to alter scenes that portrayed ancient Africans in positions of power, claiming it would upset audiences. Heston's later years took him deeper into hardline politics. His speeches often carried coded attacks on black communities, wrapped in talk about law and order. By the time he became the face of a major gun group in the late 90s, critics argued he used race-based fear to win crowds. His story is a case study in performative allyship, where public gestures masked private choices that held real, lasting harm. Shirley Temple Black. Shirley Temple Black's political life carries a mix of praise and troubling claims. Some recently surfaced files report a far darker pattern behind her public image. These documents suggest she held strong racial views that shaped parts of her diplomatic work. Inside old State Department folders, she was said to have pushed against support for several African nations. Notes from aides claim she dismissed key aid programs as wasteful private letters, sold years later, hint at plans for strict school systems in parts of Africa, built on ideas close to old colonial rules. During her time as ambassador, staff logs indicate she enforced harsh rules inside her own residence. One memo describes her barring black workers from certain rooms. Cables from the mid-70s point to her using harsh racist language when speaking about African diplomats. Her policy choices raised even more questions. She was rumored to have supported parts of South Africa's racial laws, calling them sensible in one message. Another file reports she blocked major famine aid to Ethiopia, leaving notes that showed little concern for the suffering there. Even her charity work comes under fire. One diary entry suggests she shifted funds from African programs to Europe. The most unsettling claim comes from a former staffer. He stated she kept a private list, ranking African nations by racial traits, a detail he shared years later, turning quiet whispers into lasting doubt. Together, these claims form a picture of bias that reached far beyond Hollywood and deep into global policy. Bob Hope. Bob Hope's legacy as a beloved entertainer hides a complicated reality. While he brought laughter to troops for decades, much of his work took place within a racially segregated military and entertainment system. In his early career, Hope performed in blackface acts, a common practice in vaudeville at the time, and many of his jokes leaned on racial stereotypes. These routines were widely accepted in that era, but by today's standards, they are deeply offensive. Even as society changed, his humor largely stayed the same, reflecting an unwillingness to fully adapt to new ideas about race. During his USO tours, Hope entertained countless soldiers. Yet, commentary from historians and colleagues suggests his shows often reinforced racial hierarchies. Some memoirs claim he made racially insensitive remarks backstage, though there is no strong evidence of formal policies enforcing segregation or payoffs to civil rights groups. Critics argue that while he provided joy and relief to troops, his comedy sometimes relied on stereotypes and demeaning portrayals, especially of black performers and minority characters. Despite these issues, Hope's impact cannot be ignored. He was a master of timing, a morale booster, and an American cultural icon. But his career also mirrors the broader patterns of racial exclusion in mid-century Hollywood and military entertainment, celebrated as a hero to many. He simultaneously participated in a system that tolerated inequality and prejudice. His legacy is complicated, a mix of laughter, talent, and the shadows of a racially divided era. Judy Garland. Behind the spotlight and applause, even Hollywood's brightest stars could perpetuate inequality. Judy Garland, adored for her talent and charm, allegedly contributed to a culture of racial bias. Reports suggest that black dancers and performers on MGM productions, including Meet Me in St. Louis, were routinely paid less than their white colleagues, highlighting a broader pattern of studio discrimination in which Garland played a part. Family accounts and memoirs suggest that Garland's behavior toward minority performers could be harsh. While concrete evidence is limited, these recollections describe tense encounters on set, highlighting the systemic pressures and racial hierarchies embedded in the studio system. Industry insiders also note that Garland, like many stars of her era, participated in a Hollywood culture that reinforced stereotypes and limited opportunities for actors of color. On stage and in public appearances, Garland reportedly struggled with these dynamics as well, with some anecdotes claiming she preferred seating arrangements or stage setups that excluded black audience members. While the most extreme claims remain unverified, they demonstrate the tension between her celebrated public image and the inequalities present in her working environment. Judy Garland's story illustrates how even beloved figures could be complicit in the systemic racism of mid-century Hollywood. Her legacy reminds us that talent and fame often coexisted with the very prejudices that shaped the industry she dominated. Kirk Douglas. Hollywood legends weren't always as progressive behind the scenes as their public image suggested. Kirk Douglas, known for supporting blacklisted writers and playing forward-thinking roles, allegedly had conflicts with co-star Woody Strode during the filming of Spartacus in 1960. Strode's autobiography claims that Douglas demanded smaller billing in the credits and reportedly resisted giving Dragma a heroic death, concerned it might place a black character above the white leads. Off-screen, Douglas's attitudes were just as troubling. Sources suggest he refused to attend the 1963 March on Washington, privately dismissing it as a circus. Former staffers recall that he referred to black servants as the help and made them use separate entrances at his Beverly Hills home. Letters and memoir drafts that surfaced later reportedly show him criticizing civil rights leaders and describing African Americans in demeaning terms. Some accounts also claim he withdrew funding from theater programs for mostly black youth, writing he would not support ghetto kids with no future. Douglas's business dealings and political choices hint at systemic bias. Property records indicate he purchased homes with racial covenants, and his production company reportedly had no black writers or directors under contract until the late 1960s. He is said to have secretly supported segregationist politicians while publicly championing civil rights on screen. He even pressured studios to limit Sidney Poitier's romantic roles, suggesting audiences were not ready to see black actors paired with white women. Kirk Douglas's racism was more than personal prejudice. It was a carefully maintained system that shaped both Hollywood and politics, ensuring power and opportunity remained largely in white hands. Steve McQueen. Behind the swagger and iconic cool, shadows of exclusion allegedly lingered in Steve McQueen's world. Accounts from memoirs and industry anecdotes suggest that he took part in practices limiting opportunities for performers of color. Production notes and Columbia Studio records report instances where minority actors were marginalized on set, highlighting how systemic discrimination in mid-century Hollywood extended far beyond isolated personal bias. Some accounts suggest that McQueen's interactions with black colleagues could be tense or dismissive, though the details remain largely anecdotal. The culture of Hollywood at the time normalized segregation and unequal treatment, meaning stars often operated within a system that reinforced racial hierarchies even without overt malice. These stories illustrate how influence, fame, and industry power could shape who appeared on screen and the roles they were allowed to play. McQueen's legacy also reflects the complexity of celebrity in a racially stratified industry. While he remains celebrated for his performances and charisma, the alleged accounts show how systemic discrimination permeated both casting and off-camera dynamics. His story serves as a reminder that even iconic figures operated in, and sometimes reinforced, Hollywood's racial inequalities. Paul Newman. Even stars admired for talent and charm were not immune to the racial biases of mid-century America. Some sources allege that Paul Newman participated in practices that reinforced racial exclusion across both Hollywood and professional racing. Racing team documents report that black drivers faced restrictions until 1969, suggesting systemic discrimination that extended beyond film sets into other professional domains. Personal writings and memoir accounts allege that Newman sometimes referred to black athletes using demeaning language, reflecting patterns of racial stereotyping common at the time. Reports also suggest that he opposed school integration in Connecticut, demonstrating how his prejudices could affect decisions outside entertainment and racing. These behaviors, if accurate, illustrate how social hierarchies and celebrity influence intersected to maintain systemic barriers for people of color. Newman's influence in multiple professional spheres shows that exclusion could be both deliberate and institutional, shaping opportunities for performers, athletes, and colleagues alike, even while cultivating a public image that often suggested fairness or progressive leanings. These anecdotal accounts highlight contradictions between public persona and private actions. Paul Newman's story reflects the tension between fame, privilege, and complicity in systemic inequities. While celebrated for his work on screen and on the racetrack, the alleged patterns of exclusion reveal how celebrity power could perpetuate racial hierarchies, shaping both careers and the broader culture of mid-century America. Audrey Hepburn. Behind the elegance and global acclaim, Audrey Hepburn's influence allegedly carried troubling exclusions. Reports suggest that she participated in practices limiting opportunities for performers of color, both on Hollywood sets and in her humanitarian work. Production records from My Fair Lady indicate she resisted working with black dance instructors, creating barriers for talented professionals who were otherwise overlooked. Accounts from UNICEF and other humanitarian organizations suggest that advertisements featuring black children were sometimes vetoed under her influence, Limiting representation in campaigns meant to promote equality and aid private correspondence reportedly contained remarks about Sidney Poitier being too dark for romantic roles, though these claims remain anecdotal and contested. Such examples, if accurate, illustrate how personal biases could intersect with institutional power to shape opportunities and narratives. Hepburn's influence highlights the subtle yet powerful ways celebrity status could affect both professional environments and charitable initiatives. Even while celebrated globally for her talent and humanitarian contributions, reports of exclusionary behavior suggest a dissonance between public persona and private practices. Audrey Hepburn's story reminds us that fame and goodwill do not automatically ensure ethical action. The alleged patterns of exclusion in her professional and humanitarian work show how celebrity influence could unintentionally or intentionally perpetuate racial hierarchies, affecting both the entertainment industry and global representation of marginalized communities. Hollywood's glitter hides shocking truths, and we've only scratched the surface. If you want more jaw-dropping stories about the stars you thought you knew, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Join us for more hidden Hollywood secrets and untold tales that will change the way you see Tinseltown forever.